So, I have these really vivid memories of being a kid growing up in Alaska. In the summertime, my family, we would drive down to our cabin on the Kenai Peninsula, and on the way, we'd drive along the water where the mountains basically rise straight up into the sky. And then we'd pass Girdwood, the ski town, where the mountains start to become more glaciated. And then just a ways past there, I'd see Carpathian Peak. It's a huge mountain with steep, crumbly rock walls and broken alpine glaciers, and it rises almost 6,000 feet right out of the water. So, as a 10-year-old kid, climbing wasn't even a thought in my mind. But looking up at that mountain and the lush forested valleys guarding its approach, I always wondered what it would be like to be back there. I guess you could call it my early yearning for adventure. By the time I was 17 years old, I realized I had an unlimited supply of adventure right in my backyard. Chugach State Park, with its rugged mountains, steep ice faces, and gnarly gendarme ridges, is where I would eventually learn the craft of mountaineering. And from early on, there was a feeling that if you could navigate the challenging alder-laden bushwhacks, brave the glaciated river crossings, and scramble your way up those exposed ridges and faces, well, you could probably climb anywhere. So, as I started taking road trips down to the States, well, I'd always fly through Seattle. And I remember seeing the Cascade volcanoes, but what intrigued me more were the miles of wilderness beyond the cities. And after looking at some guidebooks, I realized I'd been looking at the North Cascades. I suppose I was drawn to them because they reminded me of the Chugach. Miles upon miles of rugged peaks, surrounded by thick forest and dotted with remote alpine lakes, rivers, and the odd logging road. Those mountains definitely lit a spark of adventure in me. And as it turns out, I wasn't the only one.
It was always the getting up to a place and seeing, wow, what's over the next valley and what's beyond the next peak. And in the Cascades, oftentimes when you get up, there's this, it's been commented many times, there's this sea of peaks.
That's Lowell Skoog. He's an author, climber, historian, and skier who's been exploring the North Cascades for over 50 years.
The North Cascades for many years have been referred to as the American Alps. And the reason that they were called that is that unlike really any other range in the lower 48, the North Cascades are pretty heavily glaciated. Now, I must say the glaciers are getting kind of hammered by the warming climate. But traditionally, there are more glaciers in the North Cascades and larger than anywhere else in the country.
For a lot of folks, and even climbers who aren't real familiar with the area, they probably know about Mount Rainier. They know about Mount Baker. They probably recognize that those peaks have glaciers on them because you can see them from a distance. But for every Cascades Glacier peak, there's countless other peaks that are just as rugged, just as beautiful, and just as challenging.
It's been described that quintessential North Cascade Peak or North Cascades Peak is not a volcano. It's a big, granitic or gneissic peak, and oftentimes cloaked by glaciers.
But it's not just the glaciers that make the North Cascades unique.
The world of mountaineering, is oftentimes is discussed in terms of alpinism. This idea of a way of life of getting up high into the mountains. Well, in the North Cascades, and I'm not sure if I coined it or someone else, we have subalpinism, which is the stuff down below.
And what Lowell's describing here is called bushwhacking, something that every aspiring North Cascades mountaineer must contend with. I guess you could call it part of the charm.
One of the things you do as a North Cascades climber is you learn, well, what are the good approaches and what are the bad approaches? But occasionally you get stuck with a bad one.
Right. Do North Cascades climbers and or skiers have a little bit of a sense of pride in that their approaches are tough?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's this sort of this sense that if you can handle the whole package here, you can probably handle it just about anywhere.
The Cascades, especially the North Cascades, give you a little bit of everything when it comes to climbing.
This is Malcolm Bates. His friends call him Mac. He's an author and mountaineer who's been climbing and exploring the North Cascades since the 1960s.
It's sort of a microcosm. You've got the glaciers, you've got these wonderful mixed climbs. You may not have the big walls of Yosemite, but you have some pretty skookum rock faces. You have, stretches of wilderness where you can get yourself lost for a week, and at least for me, getting started climbing in the 60s and 70s, you could go into the North Cascades for 8 days and not see anyone. You can live out almost any mountaineering dream you want in the Cascades.
This season, we're going back in time to unlock the history of some of North America's most iconic mountains and routes. Over the years, the mountains of North America have captivated climbers around the world, leading them to the wild arenas of the Canadian Rockies, the North Cascades, the Tetons, the Alaska Range. Their stories are etched on these high alpine walls. Their visions follow lines of cold gray ice. What inspires them? What makes them come back? Who survives? Who suffers? These are the stories that we'll tell on Season 6 of the Firn Line. This is Land of the Forbidden. Are there any climbers or mountaineers, like maybe specifically from the Northwest, that their stories have inspired you over the years?
The guy who, stands head and shoulders above everybody is Fred Beckey.
The very obvious answer, I think, is Fred Beckey.
The obvious answer is Fred Beckey.
Fred Beckey, the mountaineer, the myth, the legend. If there's one name that is synonymous with Northwest and Cascades mountaineering, well, it's definitely Fred.
He was, I think, unique in the annals of mountaineering history. I can't imagine that there is anyone who has climbed as many peaks, put up as many routes as Fred Beckey. He was the epitome of the Northwest climber, which is combining rock climbing with ice climbing or, glacier climbing and bushwhacking.
Going through equipment shops and bookstores, you see the Beckey Bibles, and they're cool pieces of history.
That's Lauren Smith. She's a Montana-based climber and guide who grew up in the shadow of North Cascades and was inspired by Fred.
I practically have a shrine to Fred Beckey in my house here.
And this is Nick Sweeney, a Washington-based climber who's basically obsessed with North Cascades climbing and history.
He's the man. He's the cultural and spiritual figurehead of Cascades climbers. We all look to Fred for inspiration and guidance.
There was nobody like Fred Beckey.
So you can't really do an episode that has anything to do with the North Cascades without talking about Fred. Of course, Fred was known throughout the world as being one of North America's most important and iconic mountaineers. But it was truly the North Cascades where Fred left the most indelible mark. His list of first ascents, they're almost too numerous to count. But besides his actual climbing, it was his books that inspired generations of climbers. His trio of Cascade guidebooks, the Cascade Alpine Guides, contains so much information they're more akin to reading a college textbook. So perhaps his finest and most classic book is Challenge of the North Cascades, where he recounts a lot of earlier climbs from his youth. Here's Mac.
I was just entranced by his tales of, these amazing climbs in the mountains that I called home. The amazing adventures. And obviously doing it at a time when the approaches were so much longer.
Although Fred had begun climbing and exploring the Cascades as a young teenager, it was an ascent in British Columbia's Coast Range that really put his name on the proverbial map. In 1942, Fred, then 19, and his brother Helmy, who was 16, made one of the most extraordinary climbs of the time when they completed the second ascent of Mount Waddington. The peak had repulsed a dozen attempts before it was first climbed in 1936, and at the time it still had an incredibly fierce reputation. So It was a big deal when Fred made that climb.
He and his brother Helmy, they were teenagers when they climbed Waddington. It was front page news in Seattle when they did that. It was huge.
But Fred didn't stop there. Alongside Helmy and a multitude of other partners, he continued his exploratory climbs with an emphasis on unclimbed peaks in the North Cascades.
And so here were these teenagers that were just going at breakneck speed to get up mountains, just this insatiable. Although his brother Helmy, I think, was not as, focused. And I think he got worn down by his brother after a while. But I think Fred Beckey opened up the Cascades for us, and he, because he was it's as if the spirit of Fred Beckey, hovers over the North Cascades. There's nobody that, can lay claim to the number of first ascents, either of mountains or routes on mountains.
It is just mind-blowing to me because we have pretty luxurious roads we can drive on to get to the trailhead, and then we have, our Gaia GPX track and Beta from Facebook, and from me, coworkers from the Alpine Institute, I remember getting Beta from. And then, we've got ultralight crampons we can throw on if we're going to do an up and over and kind of some snow to rock climbing. But thinking about their mega heavy equipment, the level of climbing that they were doing, and not having really they were doing mega approaches to get to these climbs without service roads and things like that. So to me, it's just seems like a whole nother level.
And then climbing in abysmal weather.
That's right. Much of Fred's climbs that he highlighted in Challenge of the North Cascades were definitely done in abysmal weather. But the descriptions of his adventures were also vivid and captured the imagination of readers.
I just found that book magical. And so over the years, I've tried to get to as many of those peaks as he talked about, and got most of them.
Mac really has climbed a lot of the peaks Fred describes in Challenge of the North Cascades, but one of the ones he hasn't climbed is perhaps one of Fred's most classic objectives. It's called Forbidden Peak.
It's in the national park. It's in North Cascades National Park. And it's just on the west side of the crest of the Cascades. The famous Ptarmigan Traverse empties out at Cascade Pass, and then from Cascade Pass, you can look up to see Forbidden, Boston, Sahalee, Torment, and over to El Dorado. It's a wonderful, rocky scarp.
Here's Lowell Skoog.
You have not only this beautiful structure, but this beautiful setting for it with glaciers, and then particularly on the south side, what I call Alp slopes, these green rolling slopes where the glaciers have retreated, but now you've got meadows and kind of the Sound of Music environment. On the north side, you've got the glaciers going down to a real kind of ice age relic. It's called Moraine Lake. It was carved out by the glaciers ages ago, and there's hardly any vegetation down there. It really has this feeling of, the ice age in a way. So it's a stark environment in some ways. It's a really beautiful structural shape of a mountain in other ways.
So Forbidden Peak, it's a gorgeous mountain. It's almost perfectly triangular, granite, steep, in a really rugged part of the range. There's no easy way up the mountain or off of it. And while it might not be the most beautiful or the hardest climb in the Cascades, I think it really combines a lot of really great qualities to be a pretty singular example of what North Cascades climbing is like. So we take all of that base of how awesome Forbidden Peak is, and you start looking at the routes, and they're all great. I've climbed 4 or 5 routes on it. I've never climbed a bad route. And in fact, most of the routes on Forbidden are better than any of the routes on most peaks in the Cascades.
Forbidden Peak was first climbed in 1940 by a party that included Fred Beckey, and I think his brother Helmy Beckey was on that trip.
Fred was on a tear that year, making dozens of first ascents in the North Cascades. But Forbidden was unique in that it combined all the elements that make a classic North Cascades adventure: an arduous approach to a remote area, tricky glacier travel, and climbing through abysmal weather.
So it was a venture into an area that was not very much visited. There hadn't been much climbed yet in that area before there was any North Cascades National Park, before there was any Glacier Peak Wilderness. So it was just this great adventure to a peak that had not been climbed before in one of the most, beautiful areas of the North Cascades.
Although most mountaineers would be satisfied with making one first ascent on a peak, Fred's climb up Forbidden was just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, he would become entranced with the mountain, an obsession that would culminate in one of the North Cascades' most classic lines. We'll get to that and more after the break.
Fred Beckey had a really interesting history with Forbidden Peak. He also climbed the direct East Ridge in 1958, and then the Northwest Face went down the year later, and then he climbed the North Ridge as well. So he did a lot of major climbs and 3 of the 4 major first ascents of the ridges on the peak. So he knew what he was getting up to when he went up there.
And one of the things that Fred surely liked about Forbidden was its striking features.
If you look at it on a topo map, it's almost a perfect 3-sided meeting of 3 ridges. So it's this beautiful 3-sided pyramid, and on each side there are glaciers. So the south side glaciers are getting pretty small. They're kind of melting out, but the northwest side and the east side have marvelous big glaciers. The east side in particularly is covered by the Boston Glacier, which is the biggest glacier in North Cascades National Park.
It's a very humbling peak. If you go up into Boston Basin, you've got the south face, which is this big broad face. And then you have both the east and west ridges. It's a peak that the higher you go, you realize how complex, how huge it is. It's like this huge pyramid or tripod of a peak with the north and the west and the east ridges all coming together. And they're all committing.
And it's not just the ridges on Forbidden Peak that pose unique challenges. The faces and walls are all distinct from one another.
Each of the 3 faces is different. The south face is kind of steep and slabby and quite challenging as a rock climb. The east face is actually the only face that's not that great. It's kind of in-cut and it's shadowed most of the time. It's not quite as aesthetic. The northwest face is clearly the most aesthetic face of the peak. One way as I describe it is it's like an arrowhead. It has, and particularly the northwest face, when you view the northwest face, the peak just has this sense of an arrowhead, this sharp thing with kind of this central element, which is the rib of the northwest face that defines the shaft of the arrow.
And it was this striking arrow on the northwest face that drew Fred Beckey in the summer of 1959. But he needed a good partner for what would surely be a daunting adventure. So he enlisted a guy named Ed Cooper.
When you think about legendary teams, you have to think of like the context of like those legends. And within Cascades climbing, it just doesn't get much more legendary than Fred Beckey and Ed Cooper.
Cooper is one of the finest photographers who's done extensive work in all around North America. And he was quite an ambitious climber. So he and Fred got together back then and, did a classic climb together.
So these two like massive badasses came and climbed an incredibly aesthetic route that honestly looks intimidating from any perspective you see it from. And they just forged up it.
The Northwest Face in 1959 would have presented significant challenges, with serious glacier travel, exposed ridge scrambling, and steep face climbing. But Fred had some wisdom from his previous excursions on the peak.
I have to imagine that Fred realized from his other trips that Forbidden Peak has this really unique kind of flaky layering on a lot of it. So these routes that look incredibly gnarly can sometimes be easier than you might imagine for the most part, because it's like ultra steep jug hauling with really splitter awesome cracks along the way. So I think having that information from the other routes he'd done, he probably looked up at the Northwest Face and knowing that no one else had gone up there, just knew, like, if we can get up this initial knife edge ridge, then when we get on that face proper where it really flattens out, we're going to be cruising up this thing.
This is the part of the story where it's worth a reminder that back in 1959, the technology was nothing like it is today. All the navigation would have been done with intuitive route finding or compass bearings. They were probably climbing in bulky leather boots with antiquated crampons and ice axes. Rather than wearing harnesses, they probably wrapped the rope around their waists with a bowline knot. And speaking of ropes, these were not the modern ropes of today that are meant to absorb a fall by stretching. In fact, back in 1959, there was a rule, and that was the leader must not fall.
Man, I don't even know if they had nuts back then. They for sure had pitons because, those were commonly in use. But Fred also writes about using pitons on this route in some of his reports on this route. But, I think one of the biggest differences, if we're setting aside the rock protection itself, hopefully you can get something in the wall. But one of the hugest differences is the ropes. So, we're used to being 21st century sport climbers and taking whippers and relatively comfortable whippers at that. We fall under a nice stretchy ropes and they gently catch us and keep us safe. But, in 1959, they don't have anything like that. If they fell too hard on these ropes, it could just break.
But the challenging approach, the difficult route finding, and the technical climbing on rustic gear, it was worth it. Fred had an eye for the classic line, and the Northwest Face of Forbidden is as classic as it gets.
Fred Beckey, in his Cascade Alpine guidebook, he calls this route an exceptional line of purity. And I think nobody who looks at the line of the Northwest Face of Forbidden Peak and just sees how straight up the line is to the summit, I mean, you can't argue with Fred on that.
Mountaineers can argue endlessly over what makes a route classic. Obviously, this is totally subjective. But for me, it's a combination of three things that really apply to the kind of climbing you might find in the North Cascades. Number one, adventure. This can involve the approach, route finding, and variable conditions, to name a few. Number two, aesthetics. This could include the scenery, the position, and the purity of the line. And number three, the quality of climbing. For me, that would also include a climb that's not too hard, but not too easy. Basically, the perfect challenge.
The Northwest Face requires a really involved approach.
To get to Forbidden Peak, you go up an old kind of logging spur that's all overgrown.
I wouldn't call it a logging road anymore, but it's the only access into North Cascades National Park. So go up that road, park at the trailhead.
There's a climber's trail that takes you up to the Alp slopes, these meadow slopes above tree line.
So you start at the Boston Basin trailhead, just like for all the forbidden routes.
It's really, really steep, but you're in rainforest, very wooded, thick. You can't really see much, and you're doing kind of lots of switchbacks to get in there. That approach through the forested section is probably, I guess, like typically an hour and a half, 2 hours to get up to the meadow and kind of the lower alpine area.
Cross a major stream to get into the basin proper, and then you kind of veer off to the right of Forbidden Peak, climb up the Kiansabe Glacier.
It's kind of a section of receded glacier below Sahale Peak.
And then you reach Sharkfin Col, which is a pretty sharp ridge line.
Always going up and over that stands out to be extremely chalky and a little spooky to me.
I've gotten used to it, but people are usually like, what the hell are we doing here?
And Forbidden Peak is there. The Northwest Face is nowhere in sight. It's like you can't see it. It's hidden. It's totally behind the mountain. And it's not easy to get there.
The goal of the approach is to wrap around the entire mountain to the furthest possible side.
You have to go up and climb over and typically rappel over to get onto the Boston Glacier.
You make 2 rappels with some pretty significant overhead hazard from hanging snow and snow mushrooms.
And then you're kind of on the other side of the mountain, now navigating the crevasse field.
which is on the east side of the mountain. So you've made it over one side. Now you're going on the east side. You still can't see the northwest face. You're going across this Boston Glacier, biggest glacier in the North Cascades, and you have to cross the North Ridge.
Which I think the coolest part about that for me is kind of pulling out all of your tools from your toolbox.
You have to be really dialed in on your glacier travel.
And really chossy climbing and doing rappels to get back down onto the glacier. That side of the mountain is maybe more so like the north face is well traveled, but beyond that, the glacier is not traveled very much and it's pretty broken up. So there was a lot of like end running crevasses, and I remember there was a dirt pitch you had to climb with like an ice tool. It was just super loose.
It literally feels like it's made of potato chips. Like it's definitely crampons on because you're kicking into the rock to make upward progress as you're going up this thing. And then you're all of a sudden on the Forbidden Glacier, which comes all the way to the crest of the North Ridge at that point. And then you got to traverse the Forbidden Glacier down below the route and then come back up to it and traverse onto it. And then you also usually have to do some moderate ice climbing to get over to the start of the route.
So yeah, you're really like pulling all the tools out just to get to the base of the climb.
So it's a very comprehensive package just for the approach.
And finally, as you're descending the glacier, the Forbidden Glacier, around the north face, the northwest face starts to appear.
Just gorgeous, like not a soul back there, very quiet. Yeah, remote.
And as you come around the corner, there it rises above you.
Once you've made the approach into the northwest face, the mountain breaks out of the glacier and juts skyward. It's truly a mountaineer's mountain, its steep ridges meeting at the summit like a perfect pyramid, a direct and aesthetic line.
Sort of this beautiful architectural line that just it gradually gets steeper and steeper as it goes up towards the summit and just goes right to the point.
I was looking at a ridge that I thought was our route, but was actually the North Ridge. And I was like, oh, that looks pretty big. And kind of popped over the North Ridge. We bivvied near there for a night. But I remember seeing the proper northwest face, and it's very long, and it almost kind of is like a smaller, like North Ridge of Stewart. It just seems to go and go and go. And the forefront of it is just like that beautiful, massive, very broken up glacier. So I remember just thinking like, cool, we might have some shenanigans to actually get onto the ridge. But yeah, beautiful, and for me at the time, a little bit intimidating.
The lower part of the ridge is a spur that has these arms of a glacier, this paw of a glacier coming up on either side. And so the rock is emerging from the glacier and, coming down to the very point. And at some point, the glaciers, they stop and it turns into just purely a rock climb.
This ridge just erupts out of the glacier. I mean, it's, in geologic terms, it's like rocketing out of the ice. It looks totally amazing.
And so there's this very narrow, sharp edge of a kind of a fin that takes you to that point where it merges in with the upper face.
Goes up in kind of a buttress shape, and then it kind of folds over and becomes that knife edge ridge that we all love as climbers. And then you get to the end of the knife edge, and there's really one crux chimney pitch.
And it's not necessarily the best climbing, but it's a cool kind of a transition that you do, and just see the ground fall away on either side to the glaciers, and then this rib leading you up towards the tip of the arrowhead.
And above that, you are questing another 800 feet to the summit ridge, where it intersects with the west buttress, maybe 100 feet from the true summit.
So you've made it to the base of the route. The scenery's stunning. Now it's time for the climbing. Lauren, tell me about some of the memories that stand out to you from when you first climbed the northwest face.
You get to the nose or the base of the ridge. You climb some like low grade 50-degree ice. So kind of soloed up that, got onto the ridge. And I believe we started simul climbing for a little bit, and it was like low 5th class, and then there's a 5-7 pitch to the like crux 5-8 pitch, which we had our overnight packs. My gear like was pretty heavy. Had a big backpack, and it was a little bit of like a wider pitch and pretty chossy. I remember the first third or half of the ridge is pretty loose, pretty adventurous climbing with like good protection for sure. So we pitched the 5-7 and 5-8 out. And then I think the standout part of the route was the second half of the ridge. As we got higher up on the mountain, it was just the rock quality improved. It was juggy, amazing, less pro, but we kind of simuled and then soloed and then eventually took the rope off and just got into that flow state. And we could see the top and hear folks climbing the West Ridge, and it was just purely so enjoyable. The sun kind of started to poke on top of us. I remember it was chilly in the morning when we started, so the rock quality up there was very memorable after dealing with the chalk down lower.
Awesome. Nick, I know that it's pretty common for folks to take 2 or 3 days to climb the Northwest Face. You've actually climbed it, approach and all, in a single push in one day. Can you talk about some of your memories from that trip?
We climbed the initial like kind of buttress and knife edge section. That was kind of like ho-hum alpine rock, nothing too hard, but still fun. I mean, you got to love scrambling. Got through about four-ish technical pitches, but then above there, you know, you're scrambling. It's like 5-6 juggy flakes for 800 feet straight. And I remember being on that upper part of the route. The face has flattened out, so the ridge is no longer as pronounced. It's just a very faint rib on the face. You're looking down at Moraine Lake and looking across at the El Dorado Peak area with incredible glaciers over in that direction. It was a sunny day. I was up climbing with one of my best friends and climbing partners, and we were flowing. Still to this day, it's one of my proudest performances in the mountains is how we climbed that route and how efficient we were. And it just felt like we were flying. And yeah, for that reason, it's one of my favorite routes I've ever climbed.
Lowell, you first climbed the Northwest Face probably 25 years ago now or longer. What do you remember about being up there?
As you climb it, you know, the views open up. You're looking out across this facade that connects Mount Forbidden Peak to Mount Torment. And in the background is your Blaine, your partner. You're looking down at Moraine Lake and the Inspiration Glacier on El Dorado Peak and other peaks in the North Cascades. And so the views get better and better as you work your way up. And the upper part is, again, the rib taking you up. And it's not terribly difficult. The rock is pretty good. It's kind of, low class 5, something like that, and takes you right to the top. The top is a very small summit. So again, it's really aesthetic. It's not a big blob of a peak. It's quite a point of a peak.
Awesome. Sounds amazing. And what can you tell me about the descent to the peak? What's it like to get off of there?
Typically what we would do is we would descend sort of the east ledges route. You'd rappel eastward down to some ledges, and then you could traverse them fairly easily, maybe running belays or something like that, and then cross over the East Ridge and descend down into Boston Basin. The other way would be to come down the West Ridge, which is a lovely climb, but it's on its own, but it's more complicated. There's more. You'd probably be doing some down climbing with a rope on and maybe more rappelling, and so on. So yeah, the descent is not the prettiest part of climbing Forbidden Peak. It's kind of the dues you have to pay to get off the peak.
Mac, you've been exploring the North Cascades since the 1960s. You were inspired by Fred's book, Challenge of the North Cascades, as a youngster. You're in your 70s now. You're still climbing, and you mentioned that Forbidden is one of those peaks from that book that's eluded you all these years.
That's right. And it's one of those peaks that I always said, I'll get there. And of course, suddenly I'm in a position, I'm hoping next year to get up. Even if it's guided, I'm not too proud anymore. And the West Ridge is, it is such, it's the perfect climb. It's got everything.
All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me today. Big thanks to Lowell, Mac, Lauren, and Nick for sharing their stories and their experiences up on that amazing, beautiful mountain. This show was recorded, written, and produced by me, Evan Phillips, and most of the music today was curated from Artlist. I will leave a track list in the show notes. If you enjoy the Firn Line, please consider becoming a subscriber over on Patreon. Also, leave a review over on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're looking for bonus clips, the Firn Line has a YouTube channel, so make sure and go to YouTube, search the Firn Line, and check out some of the videos we've got over there. And lastly, a big thank you to the Season 6 sponsors of the Firn Line, Alaska Rock Gym, and the Hoarding Marmot. All right, well, take care of yourselves. Peace out. We'll catch you next time on the Firn Line.
you.